Welcome to the channel where history meets mind-blowing facts. Here your knowledge will get a powerful boost with every video. From hidden events to legendary figures, we cover it all. In the summer of 1941, the world watched in disbelief as Nazi Germany unleashed one of the largest and most ambitious military campaigns in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks, aircraft and artillery, stormed across the vast border into the Soviet Union. It wasn't just an invasion, it was an ideological crusade. Hitler believed that conquering the East would give Germany the Lebensraum it needed, living space, for its people. But behind this quest for territory was something far darker. The belief that Slavs were inferior, that communism had to be annihilated, and that the Soviet Union had to be crushed at all costs. In the initial months, it looked like Hitler's gamble would pay off. The German war machine swept through the Soviet lands like wildfire. City after city fell. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Many executed or sent to die in brutal POW camps. By late summer, the Wehrmacht had advanced so far and so fast that even Stalin was shocked. Moscow was under threat. Leningrad was surrounded. But for Hitler, one city stood out above all others, Stalingrad. Not because of its military value at first, but because of its name. This was Stalin's city, a symbolic stronghold. If Hitler could seize it, it would be a psychological dagger to the heart of the Soviet Union. But Stalingrad wasn't just about pride or names. It sat on the banks of the mighty Volga River, a critical transportation and supply route. It was also a gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus, fuel Hitler desperately needed to sustain his war effort. Without oil, the tanks would stop, the planes would ground, and the dream of a Nazi empire would wither. So in the summer of 1942, Hitler diverted a significant portion of his forces south, ordering them to seize Stalingrad and the Caucasus in a two-pronged attack. What followed would become one of the deadliest and most brutal confrontations in human history. As German forces pushed closer to Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, began a relentless bombing campaign. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Fires raged for days. Civilians had nowhere to run. The city, once bustling with life, turned into a smoldering wasteland. But this destruction, ironically, would become a blessing for the defenders. The ruins created an unforgiving battlefield, perfect for close-quarters combat, where the Germans' technological superiority meant little. Still, as the German Sixth Army under General Paulus began its assault, the situation looked dire for the Soviets. The Red Army, battered and demoralized from months of retreat, now had to make a stand. Stalin issued a chilling order: not a step back. Any soldier who retreated without orders was to be shot. Thousands of blocking units were placed behind the front lines to execute deserters. It was fight or die. Soviet soldiers were thrown into battle with little training and sometimes without rifles, expected to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. But they fought with a terrifying determination, because they knew what was at stake. Behind them were their homes, their families, their country. The battle quickly devolved into a savage and chaotic nightmare. Buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. Fighting took place in sewers, basements, stairwells, even inside the shells of destroyed factories. The Germans began calling it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because of how they had to crawl, hide, and fight like animals. Snipers hunted each other in a deadly game of patience and precision. Every corner was a trap. Every shadow could be death. And yet, both sides kept pouring more men into this inferno. The German High Command believed victory was near. They controlled 90% of the city, but that last 10%, a thin strip of land along the Volga, was held with iron will by the Soviets. Supplies and reinforcements were ferried across the river under constant fire. Many didn't make it, their boats torn apart by shells or machine guns. But the ones who did kept the flame alive. Among them were not just soldiers but volunteers, factory workers, students, even women and children. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It had become a symbol of defiance. While the Germans pushed forward, something crucial was happening. Behind the scenes, Soviet generals, particularly the brilliant Zhukov, were preparing a deadly trap. The Germans, obsessed with capturing the ruins of Stalingrad, had stretched themselves thin, exposing their flanks. Those flanks weren't held by elite German troops but by poorly equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces. They were vulnerable, and Soviet intelligence knew it. A storm was brewing, and the Germans were walking straight into it. But, for now, they continued their relentless assault, unaware that the very ground they fought so hard to capture was about to turn into their grave. The first bombs fell on Stalingrad in August 1942, turning the city into a blazing furnace. The sky was thick with smoke, and firestorms swept through the narrow streets. Entire apartment blocks collapsed in seconds. Bodies lined the sidewalks. Civilians, caught completely off guard, had no escape. There were no safe zones, no shelters strong enough. Mothers screamed as they searched for their children. Entire families were buried beneath rubble. And this was only the beginning. The Luftwaffe had launched one of the most intense aerial bombardments of the war. Hitler had ordered the city to be wiped from the map, and his bombers were executing that order with terrifying precision. When the German Sixth Army finally entered the city, what they found was not the bustling industrial center they had expected, but a haunting, smoldering ruin. Yet that destruction played against them. The streets were choked with debris, tanks couldn't maneuver, artillery fire had no clear line of sight. And hiding within the shattered remains were Soviet defenders, ready to strike from the shadows. Every pile of bricks was a sniper's nest. Every room, a possible ambush. The Germans had trained for blitzkrieg, for fast-moving open warfare. Not this. Not this grinding, close-quarters nightmare where every inch had to be fought for with blood. From the moment they stepped into the city, the Germans were pulled into a different kind of war. This wasn't a battle of armies. It was a street-by-street, room-by-room descent into madness. Soldiers fought over stairwells, bathrooms, and even beds in destroyed buildings. The front lines constantly shifted. One moment a German unit would control a building, and by nightfall it would be taken back by Soviet troops, then again retaken by Germans the next morning. It became a cycle of endless assault and counter-assault, and no one could tell where the front actually was. It was chaos, and inside that chaos both sides bled endlessly. The Red Army didn't fight with superior equipment or numbers. They fought with raw will. Soldiers were thrown into battle with no guarantees of survival. sometimes without food, sometimes without ammunition. There were even cases where one rifle was shared between two men, the second told to pick it up when the first fell. The city's defense was held together by pure desperation and ruthless discipline. Stalin had ordered that under no circumstance could the city fall. Retreat was punishable by death. NKVD troops stood behind Soviet lines ready to shoot any man who turned away from the fight. It was brutal, inhuman, but effective. Men stayed and fought because they had no choice. Civilians who hadn't fled before the bombing were trapped inside a living hell. Food disappeared. Clean water was nearly impossible to find. Diseases spread. Children roamed through wreckage searching for scraps. Women took up arms or worked in field hospitals, treating the wounded with whatever supplies they could scavenge. At night, the city echoed with gunfire, explosions, and the low groans of the dying. Sleep became a luxury. No one knew if they'd survive the next hour, let alone the next day. There were no heroes here, just people trying to survive in the darkest place on earth. For the German soldiers, it was a psychological war as much as a physical one. They had been promised a swift victory, told that the Soviets would collapse like a house of cards. But the Soviets didn't collapse. They clung on, and the city refused to die. The Germans quickly realized this wasn't going to be a quick conquest. Instead, it was a place where hope withered and men disappeared. The endless resistance, the cold, the hunger, and the ever-present threat of snipers turned the soldiers into hollow shells. They marched into Stalingrad full of confidence. They soon found themselves caught in a nightmare that no amount of training had prepared them for. The Soviets used everything they had to hold the line. Factory workers converted machine parts into weapons. Women became nurses and snipers. Teenagers joined the ranks. Every citizen became a soldier in some way. The legendary Pavlov's house, a fortified apartment block held by a small group of Soviet troops, became a symbol of resistance. Surrounded and under constant fire, they held out for months, denying the Germans a key position. Across the city, stories like this repeated, small groups of defenders standing against overwhelming odds, refusing to give an inch. As the brutal fighting in Stalingrad raged on through the bitter autumn of 1942, Hitler remained convinced that victory was within reach. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had pushed deep into the ruined city and occupied nearly all of it. They believed the Soviet defenders were hanging on by a thread, just days away from collapse. But what the Germans couldn't see, what they refused to believe, was that the Red Army was preparing something enormous. Hidden behind the lines, deep in the frost-covered steppes, Soviet high command had been quietly amassing a storm. It wasn't just a counterattack, it was a trap, one that would shatter Hitler's illusion of invincibility and turn Stalingrad into a graveyard for an entire army. The plan was called Operation Uranus. It wasn't aimed directly at the German forces in the center of Stalingrad. Instead, it targeted the flanks, the soft underbelly of the German position. These flanks weren't guarded by elite Wehrmacht divisions but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. Poorly equipped, undertrained, and stretched too thin, they were considered secondary forces, and Hitler had believed they would be enough. But the Soviets had done their homework. They knew these units were vulnerable, and they prepared to exploit that weakness with brutal precision. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the silence of the icy plains was broken by an eruption of Soviet artillery. Thousands of shells screamed through the sky, crashing down on the Romanian lines north of Stalingrad. The explosions were relentless, turning trenches into craters, bunkers into death traps. Under this fiery curtain, wave after wave of Soviet tanks and infantry surged forward. The Romanians were overwhelmed in hours, many units breaking and fleeing. Others simply vanished, swallowed by the chaos. A day later, a second offensive struck the southern flank, meeting similar success. And within just 72 hours, the unthinkable happened. Two massive Soviet pincers met west of Stalingrad, encircling over 250,000 Axis soldiers. The Germans inside the city were stunned. One moment they were fighting house to house in Stalingrad, and the next they found themselves cut off from the rest of the world. There were no more supply lines, no food, no fuel, no reinforcements. Just snow, fire, and the slow realization that they were surrounded. Paulus reported the situation to Hitler, asking for permission to attempt a breakout. But Hitler, obsessed with holding Stalingrad at any cost, forbade it. "The Sixth Army will stay where it is," he declared. "It will fight to the last man." It was a death sentence. To keep the army alive, the German High Command came up with a desperate plan. They would supply the Sixth Army by air. Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised that his planes could deliver hundreds of tons of supplies each day. But he was wrong. Fatally wrong. The weather was brutal. Soviet anti-aircraft guns lined the skies. Airstrips were icy and hard to land on. At best, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver a fraction of what was needed. Soldiers began starving. Ammunition dwindled. Horses were slaughtered. The ruins of Stalingrad were silent now. The gunfire had stopped. The screams had faded. What remained was a city unrecognizable, blanketed in snow and ash, scarred by months of relentless combat. The once vibrant streets were now filled with frozen corpses, twisted steel and shattered concrete. Trees were stripped bare, buildings reduced to skeletons, and the mighty Volga River, once a symbol of power and industry, flowed quietly past the destruction. The battle was over. But the consequences had just begun. The surrender of the German Sixth Army wasn't just a military loss. It was a catastrophic psychological blow for Hitler and the entire Nazi command. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered. Until Stalingrad, the German army had seemed unstoppable, carving through Europe with precision and terror. But here, in a city most hadn't even heard of before the war, the Nazis met something they hadn't expected: unyielding resistance, brutal endurance, and a willingness to sacrifice everything. The defeat exposed the limits of German military power and marked the turning point of the Second World War. For the Soviets, it was a moment of grim triumph. They had held the line, defied the odds, and broken the backbone of Hitler's Eastern offensive. The Red Army, once on the brink of collapse, now surged with momentum. The victory at Stalingrad rallied the Soviet people like never before. Factories roared to life again. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Morale soared across the Soviet Union. They had survived the storm, and now they were ready to push back. Stalingrad lit the fire that would eventually carry them all the way to Berlin. But the cost of that victory was nearly unimaginable. Over 2 million lives were lost: soldiers, civilians, and prisoners. Stalingrad became a grave for hundreds of thousands of men who never returned home. Streets were littered with the frozen remains of young soldiers, many no older than 20. Mothers buried their children. Families were torn apart. And those who survived carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. No one escaped, Stalingrad untouched. The German prisoners who marched out of the city did so in silence, their faces hollow, their eyes empty. Many were marched through the ruins under Soviet guard, forced to witness the destruction they had helped create. Some collapsed in the snow, unable to walk. Others were beaten or shot for falling behind. They were loaded onto trains, herded into prison camps, and subjected to freezing temperatures, disease, and starvation. Of the roughly 91,000 taken captive, only about 5,000 ever made it back to Germany, some returning nearly a decade later, broken and forgotten. The psychological toll on the German high command was severe. Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster, instead blaming his generals, his allies, and even the weather. His trust in his officers deteriorated. Paranoia grew. He began to take tighter control over military decisions, often ignoring the advice of seasoned commanders. The defeat at Stalingrad changed him. The confidence was gone, replaced by desperation. His dream of conquering the East had been derailed, and it would never recover. Meanwhile, in the West, the world watched in stunned silence. The newspapers carried the headlines. Radio broadcasts detailed the staggering losses. Stalingrad became a symbol, not just of Soviet resilience, but of hope. Hope that the Nazi war machine could be stopped, that the tide could turn. Allied leaders recognized the importance